Arguments, excellent adjudications, 4 have risen to the top. We'd like to invite the teams to come on stage now in order of their positions. In opening government, Yale. In opening opposition, Stanford. In closing government, TUFTS. And in closing government, a team from Harvard. This debate will also be judged by an excellent panel. It involves Sharmila Parmanan, former world's chief adjudicator, debate trainer in over 27 countries from the Philippines. Sharmila is a global debate staple if you're used to debate, and she's excellent. We invite Sharmila to take her place on the panel. We'll also be joined by Gemma Buckley, who is the past chief adjudicator of the Australasia Debating Championship. She was, when she competed, the second best debater in the world at Worlds in Chennai, and she's been coaching in Australia and in Texas, United States. She's also eminently qualified. We're pleased to have her on the panel as well. Nishe Akil, who won the award for top adjudicator at this competition last year in Alaska, judged the final round of the championship in Alaska last year, has been debating since she was in Pakistan at World Schools and is one of the coaches of Cornell University. We welcome Nishe as well. We also welcome Josh Martin, who was a former champion of this competition, a former chief adjudicator, and will be the upcoming chief adjudicator for this staging in Denver next year. We welcome Josh as well. We also welcome Nelson Kizo, who was a successful debater from St. John's, a chief adjudicator at tournaments this year, and was in the semifinals of this tournament last year. Pleased to have Nelson. We have Lindsay Caroline Dixon from Clinton University. She was a chief adjudicator just 2 weeks ago at the Pan American University Debating Championship in Jamaica. She is the upcoming chief adjudicator of this tournament in Denver as well. And she judged the final rounds of Alaska last year, so we're welcome to have her back in the final round of this tournament. And they just put me on because I go to Morehouse. So Alright, we're going to start the round shortly if all the judges will take their positions. And we'll call this house to order. Prime Minister to defend the motion that stands in their name. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me? Excellent. Ever since Black Americans have gotten the vote, they were promised inclusion, but they have yet to have it. We see in the status quo rampant disenfranchisement of the form of voter ID laws, gerrymandering, etc., which means that democracy does not work for Black Americans. But more subtly, and perhaps even more insidiously, You should have an incredibly hard time believing that an entire part of that population cannot feel anything close to proportional representation when it comes to the race of candidates that represent people in this democracy. You should have zero reason for believing that black individuals are less qualified, less capable of being representatives of the general population. So what that means is we say there is certainly discrimination in the status quo. And that means that the promise to African Americans has been broken. How can we move past the color line? That is the question we answer from Open Government. The model is quite simple. We think that until the Democratic Party does things like in all elections, local elections, past presidential elections, state elections, etc., seeking out, that is scouting out candidates who they are able to field, who are black Americans, who would pick individuals that they would then fund to try as hard as they can to win those races. To the extent that wider parts of that establishment might think that those individuals are worse candidates, we would be willing to put even more fund behind them so that they get the sort of support from the Democratic Party that they deserve. We have 3 points to have from Open Government. First of all, we're going to explain why the status quo, there is a lack of representation. That a promise deferred of the type that we have seen to black Americans is the same thing as a promise broken. Second of all, we're going to explain why our policy forces the hand of political establishments to better represent those interests that have for so long been ignored. Finally, third, we're going to explain on our side of the house how we can change the epistemic narratives about what it means to speak as a black American and thus be taken seriously by the rest of American society. First then, why is there a lack of representation in the status quo? What the Democratic establishment, and thus the Democratic Party, have fallen into the trap of is taking a population for granted. That is to say, it is actively bad that they have a monopoly over the status quo, over the black vote, and as such have very little incentive to represent it to the fullest extent. What happens then in the status quo is in state elections, for example, Democrats support policies that are counter to the interests of this population, such as supporting, such as attacking affirmative action in California. We think then, for example, the fact that Clinton, even though he holds big margins in places like the South, because of the black vote, still refuses to do things like support Black Lives Matter or advocate policies that advocate an end to police violence are clear examples where the establishment does not transfer representation in the form of votes to representation in the form of policy interests. What happens then in the status quo is that we have seen the power of black voters systematically silenced and diluted by this sort of complacency from the Democratic Party. It means that they are subject to the tyranny known as no other option, because they say that the Democratic Party is the only party that can represent their interests, and yet that one party that proposes to do so does not even do that. Closing.
Does Donald Trump think Black Lives Matter?
Excellent question. So we will address why it is that the Republican Party will probably react better to this, or whatever incarnation is left after Donald Trump is done. But to the extent that on their side of the house, they say blacks would be forced to go to Republicans, that is also not an accurate picture. Because we actually think that the Democratic Party has a reason to be responsive to this, and it is this broad philosophical argument which we'll expand upon in a second. It is this. We think the Democratic Party has a contract with individuals who are members, that the votes themselves constitute a contract, because they mean that those individuals have pledged their support to the party in return for representation of a concrete form. Because the Democratic Party draws strength from this huge proportion of its members, they owe an obligation to actually represent those interests, and as such, that is a paramount obligation that has to be rectified. It's not in the status quo. Second then, what happens to the landscape of American politics? I think this deals more directly with the PY that we got from closing. There are two scenarios that we outlined then from Opening Government. First, we think it is very likely the Democratic Party concedes. They also, surprisingly, do not want Donald Trump or whoever to win because they are not that party. So what happens then is they have a big incentive to make concessions to these plans, to say, we are willing to have this sort of commitment, we are willing to fund those candidates that are probably no less qualified, but face the subtle forms of discrimination we'll talk about in a second. What this means then is on our side of the house uniquely, we are more likely to get candidates who are African American, and we think that constitutes a better representation of that population's interests in American politics. What this means then is what uniquely applies to African American candidates and no others is they understand the lived experiences of what it means to have lived and experienced those sorts of problems, which means they directly translate to representations in affairs. What this means is, it is not the case we think other candidates are actively hostile to the interests that black Americans see as important, but it is very easy for them to deprioritize them with respect to other things that they might think are more characteristic of their platform, i.e. economic inequality, wonder who that is about, as we have seen, and as such, they're unwilling to actively represent those interests to the fullest extent that they deserve. But second of all, we do think there's a case, potentially, where the Democratic Party does not agree for some time, in which case African Americans will have to do something like a protest, explain why it is that they think the party should respond to their interests. But what this does then to the landscape of American politics is free up a huge voting bloc that all parties, by virtue of the incentive to win elections, have an incentive to go after. What this means then is Republicans, or whatever's left of that party after this election, must appeal to that particular segment where they have zero incentive to do so in the status quo because of the perceived monopoly that the Democratic Party has over black voters. What this means then is there now is an incentive for people who identify as conservative politicians in America to actually shift their positions and try to understand what it is that they can do to represent those interests. We think this is perfectly in line with the sort of demographic shifts that we've seen in the status quo, where Republicans realize that rural Americans are becoming the minority, and as such they must change their positions to be able to capture voting blocks like these. That is a particularly strong incentive for both the Democratic and the Republican Party to now care about what this population wants. But also on our side of the House then, we think this puts an end to outright disenfranchisement. That when the Republican Party does things like advocate voter ID laws, gerrymandering, etc., it is in line with stopping the sort of monopoly effect that the Democratic Party has over black voters. When they themselves can capture those voters by simply representing their interests, that incentive goes away, the incentive to lobby those things thus goes away as well. Finally, third point, how we change narratives about the inclusion of African Americans in society. We think that in particular, African Americans have been oppressed in American society, and the sort of non-inclusion that we have outlined is particularly pernicious, because it means that that population is now forced to advocate for their interests outside of the political system, in the form of things that might spill over into violence, things like rioting, which we think might be justified because they're expressions of the anger and the conditions that that population is subject to. But what this means then is that for that population, there's an additional barrier to enfranchisement, and that is respectability politics. That to say, for example, black Americans say to each other that you should, for example, respect yourself before you can respect other people. That white Americans also tell people who are black and young and protesting the exact same sort of thing. I mean, it's much harder for individuals to get that voice that then translates into support in the political system. We think the solution then is actual inclusion in the political system itself. That is the specific promise of democracy that is made to African Americans. That is the promise we hope to make good on from opening government.
Is this like audible? Sorry, I'm the boss, anyone say this? Recognize that the African American community threatens to boycott Democrats on a very regular basis. Indeed, a large number of people have made this exact threat every election cycle since 1992. That is why Hillary Clinton moved to the left on issues of Black Lives Matter, and why she is now moving back to the left after Bill Clinton's comments a week ago caused her polling numbers with African Americans to drop 25%. To that extent, given that her competitor in this race is Bernie Sanders, who by the way is also white, so doesn't fit the criteria that these guys talked to you about as being essentializing for exactly the kinds of policies that are most important, we say that the relevant thing to recognize here is that given they've threatened this and not used it in the past, the Democratic Party simply will not believe them, given there are 6 months to go and they cannot meaningfully select the number of candidates that opening government has said that they need to. That means that they have to take the short-term loss of a series of down-ballot losses in November elections. We say that loss is sufficiently bad in and of itself to make this policy unjustifiable. We'll win the long-run battle as well. Two things in this speech. Firstly, the short run. Secondly, even if there is acquiescence, why the consequences for the African American community will be terrible. What are we happy for? We're happy for the Democratic Party to have continuing African American representation, recognizing that the African American caucus has already set targets of 10 to 15% to be achieved in the next 2 election cycles. We think those are realistic targets that can be achieved over time by acquiescence and agreement between different members of the party, rather than continual hostility. We're happy also for movements such as Black Lives Matter to prioritize turnout for certain candidates and for certain policy issue areas in the way they have very successfully for the last 2 years. 3 areas of rebuttal first. Firstly, this idea that African Americans are taken for granted by the Democratic Party. Firstly, this is trivially false so long as there is more than one candidate running for the candidacy of the Democratic Party in any given seat, insofar as they therefore have to compete for the African American vote, something that opening government conveniently forgets. Secondly, Secondly, on this South Carolina thing, we say it is insulting to say that candidates should be voting for someone who looks like them, regardless of the policies, instead of voting for Hillary Clinton, because they might have very legitimate reasons to vote for someone who say will be able to win, will be able to compromise to ensure that they have continual voter ID laws, someone who's been continually fighting for the basic rights of people in ways that other candidates like Bernie Sanders have flip-flopped left, right and centre on. To that extent, we think they are absolutely legitimate in prioritising experience over other essentialising characteristics. They need to tell us why they're sufficiently base and insulting to say that that's the only thing that we should care about. The second thing they say is that African American candidates will understand people's lived experiences and change, right? I posit that given there are a large number of people who could be African American candidates within the House, right, given that, there's only so much publicity that these guys get, losing funding to another candidate the Democratic Party machine happily puts up in the next cycle is sufficient to these people to ensure they will toe the party line rather than adhere to their lived experiences. We see this from every African American candidate who runs with the Republican Party, like Alan West, who will happily abandon all of their issues that claim to be responsive to the African American community as soon as partisan issues are at stake. But then they say the GOP will start chasing after the African American vote. This is just from cloud nine. Firstly, because the GOP would do this anyway in the status quo if they thought that there was some vote here. They don't need Henry to tell them that the African American community might vote for them in order for that to happen. The only consequence of this is that either they vote for a candidate who is realistically not going to move substantially, or they don't vote at all. But secondly, in the states where they do succeed in status quo, like Wisconsin, where Scott Walker won a substantial number of African Americans, they win by pushing social conservatism and ignoring the fact that on voter ID, on collective bargaining and other rights, African Americans persistently lose. To that extent, that is manipulative and evil. Third and finally, this idea that people on our side are forced to advocate through riots. We say, to the extent that there exist reasonable mechanisms by which people can increase their representation that are working in status quo, they should use that. Your side makes them look to the 75% of the Democratic Party, many of whom are actually quite socially conservative. You make African Americans illegitimately look like rioters by saying my way or the highway and no reasonable compromise. To that extent, you put them in a vastly worse position optically. So, first on the short run, recognise the primary duty of the Democratic Party towards African Americans should be to ensure their continued economic and political survival, insofar as they face existential rights questions with the current Congress unwilling to pass basic things. And the public recognises very much on the side of passing reforms that are likely to help people. The deaths, tragically, of Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and thousands of others I could name are sufficient to recognise this is the unique moment for passing substantial change. Recognise John Boehner was willing to put substantial police reforms on the table in the last 18 months, something that has never happened before in history. This is a crucial time, and they poison the water. Why? Well, within the general election, we say it's quite likely that the GOP will win, now and in future, insofar as they shift the centre ground and large numbers of Democratic moderates shift on the basis they see the GOP being co-opted by a movement that refuses to compromise. That means, firstly, you get appalling economic policy that is distinctly racial insofar as it uses racialized images of welfare queens in order to get policies that suit a small number of elites. You get explicitly racist laws along this line. Secondly, you get worse policing policy insofar as the GOP no longer sees the need to win that centre ground because the Democratic Party have less power in general to broker deals in state houses and senates and the kind of level where these policing laws are regularly being discussed in status quo. Thirdly, the permanent denial of voter rights that Henry hints at is devastating at the point where large numbers of African Americans are locked out of ever getting representation in the future because they can never get to the ballot box 4 years down the line. And fourthly, because some of the most prominent African American politicians lose out on their side of the house. When Cory Booker loses his seat as a direct result of the African Americans refusing to turn out, we think that it's unlikely to look good for the ability of the African American community to impact change within the Democratic Party, or indeed the way that they're likely to be treated. Sure.
Is there anything inherently that links liberal economic policy with more conservative social issues?
I'm willing to say that when Republican policy explicitly makes some of the worst off people, and specifically along racial lines, hurts their ability to exist, that is sufficient to justify the socially liberal economic welfare policies of the Democratic Party. What happens within the Democratic Party? Because no, they can't abolish all their candidates within 6 months. The fact that there are no African Americans, they can't put up 1,000 new candidates, mean their pollsters just shift towards trying to win without the African American community, which means Clinton no longer has any incentive to care about moving, but equally that African Americans within the Democratic Party are forced into terrible situations. I've already told you about how a large number of them are likely to lose or be forced to run as independents or otherwise abandon the party in ways that split the African American community from the Democratic Party. Secondly, why even if there is acquiescence are the consequences terrible? Because it's not just Trump within the GOP, who will be able to paint the Democrats as a crazy essentializing party, be the large number of Americans who still believe that affirmative action is illegitimate and that the GOP is a race-baiting party that is held hostage by a small number of people. You literally play into that image and allow every purple state to turn red on your side at the point where the moderates shift away. You also lead to accusations of rigging and hostility within districts when people no longer see their candidate as representative of them, but rather representative of a quota, which means the general grassroots support you need to pass things disappear. You burn all political capital that African Americans have, and you also encourage breakaway candidates, because at the point where you're a wealthy, multiple-term Democrat senator, you may as well run as an independent at the point where you see yourself being supplanted by an inexperienced African American candidate put up within a small period of time. To that extent, you make it harder for the GOP, the Democratic Party, to get the coherent policy change that it needs. This is an appalling idea that goes far too far on a really important cause. I'm exceptionally proud to oppose.
Government side, we welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here we are.
Great, can everybody hear me? The vast majority of constructive argumentation that we hear from the leader of the opposition assumes that the Democratic Party is not going to concede and do things to actually empower the very many viable black candidates that we say exist in the status quo. So recognize that they fundamentally need to prove that that's true for any of the argumentation to matter. But the problem for them is that the introduction to his speech undermines his argumentation when he tells you that as people have done this in the past, politicians like Hillary Clinton have actually pivoted their positions on issues, have moved to the left, and have actually responded to the pressure. So we think the only thing that you can glean from this is that we must do more in order to make sure that those promises actually turn into tangible policy. We must end the world in which the Democrats take a huge population that is essentially to their victory for granted. With that said, 3 areas of the debate. First, I'm going to talk about the principle, which I think they vastly undercover. Second of all, I'm going to just discuss whether or not the Democrats are actually going to take this deal. And finally, I'm going to discuss the outcomes, so both if the Democrats take the deal and if they don't. First, on the principle. We say that the status quo is fundamentally unjust, and as a result, even if the pragmatic outcomes are unsure, people must do something, and individuals are entitled to take action if they've been systematically disenfranchised in the status quo, which we think is what is currently obviously happening. So the only responses we get for this is, no, guys, like in the presidential election, Bernie and Hillary Clinton are competing for the African American vote, so clearly there's some recognition of the power of this voting bloc. But I ask you, are they actually competing? Insofar as both candidates have had very widely publicized negative interactions with huge social movements like Black Lives Matter, none of them have actually made positive policy commitments to focus on a huge voting bloc within the Democratic Party. I doubt that they are actually competing for these votes. But second of all, this is not just about the presidential election, right? We think the vast majority of elections that we're talking about that actually have a huge amount of impact on people's lives are local and state elections, right? So this is where they don't engage with why the status quo is so unjust. They say that a reasonable target is to get 10 to 15% increase in the number of black candidates. We think that is indicative of what is wrong with the status quo. People think it is reasonable to actually have a difference between the broader availability of black people in the population and the number of individuals elected to representative bodies. Obviously, there is a problem with this picture. So just because Bernie and Hillary may be competing, which I doubt, it is clearly an issue that on the local level, despite a wide availability of candidates, you don't see them supported, you don't see them given funding. So clearly, the principle follows, and the status quo is very unjust. Second area of the debate is whether or not the Democrats will actually take the deal. We think obviously they will. So essentially they tell us that it's not a credible commitment on the part of black voters. But as I said already in their introduction, they literally give examples of times when politicians interpreted this as a very credible commitment. So the fact that when black individuals protested against comments made by Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton actually made tangible shifts in her policy advocation. We think that's an example of the fact that they will do this. But furthermore, this is different than any other example in the past. It is not merely one individual who has prominence within a community. The most notion is that African Americans writ large ought to engage in this. This is a special example of collective action that we think will devastate any prospect of electoral success for the Democrats. When you look at the primary elections that are happening right now, you recognize that this is such an important demographic for actually allowing them to field successful candidates. That's why we think they're actually going to take the deal. I'll take closing.
Black politicians like Obama are often already strategic because they're good at raising turnout. Why don't they exist currently in the status quo? Like, if the Democratic Party generally benefits when they run.
Great, so this is what we've been iterating over and over and over again. The reason why they don't raise these candidates in the status quo is because fundamentally it's not worth the investment to them. They have a certain amount of political capital that they can use to advocate for certain policies. Given that they think that African Americans will always vote for Democrats because the alternative is so horrible, why invest their political capital to actually get tangible policy outcomes for that community when instead they can target blue-collar white voters or women or individuals who are maybe liberal in economic issues despite being socially conservative? We actually decouple the assumption that it is not an investment worth making. We make it a necessary investment, which is what actually gets tangible outcomes on our side of the house. No, not right now. So the final area of the debate, though, is outcomes. So first, if the Democrats actually engage in this. So we tell you that this is going to lead to tangible positive policy outcomes because individuals have an incentive to now, will be better able to understand what policies have a positive impact on the community. But moreover, because this is a voting bloc that even black candidates cannot assume that they will always have access to unless they are successful and validate and keep people turning out, things of that sort, we think it gives them added incentive to pass good policies. The only response we get is that these individuals will just toe the line. But this isn't the case, right? Because now, as I've already explained, you actually have to invest in the voters that are a key part of your electoral success rather than taking them for granted and assuming that they will always turn out. So great, that is the most likely outcome, and clearly we get positive impacts. This is also where we get the great socialization about the fact that you now see African American individuals empowered in politics, put in positions of leadership, which has huge impacts on younger generations as well. Moving on to the less likely outcome, if the Democrats don't take this deal, this is all Stanford really talks about. So first they say that the Republicans are already competing for black voters. Clearly this is not the case, right? Given the comparison currently is between Trump and Hillary Clinton, likely, they assume that this isn't a demographic that they can ever capture. When it is announced that it is not the case that Hillary Clinton can depend on the vote, there is a huge incentive to actually capture this. We think this is especially likely and more important in local elections as well, where the division is less concrete and the demographic differences might be different. But next they say that they're just going to push for social conservative. We think it is deeply problematic to assume what a correct vote is. Our philosophical stance is that the correct result of the policy is whatever black African Americans advocate for. So we are agnostic on the issue of what that policy is, as long as it actually mirrors what we think this community wants. But second of all, I don't think it's the case that voters are going to be completely blind to the fact that the policy doesn't mirror their economic interests as well. This is just a little patronizing. Finally, they say that you're going to get bad policy because the Democrats have less power. We think individuals, as long as the voting bloc is not committed, will constantly compete and will constantly try to gain these voters. Very proud to propose.
We welcome the Deputy Leader of the Park. Here again.
The major problem with the OG case is that it doesn't take on the two burdens that it needs to and only takes on one. What do I mean? They need to prove simultaneously that the Democrats will take the deal and that the Democrats will also win the election as a result of taking this deal. Insofar as that is true, it is devastating that they didn't respond to Harry's argument about why black people in particular care about winning elections in the short run. Because what I'm going to show you in my speech is that even if the Democrats do acquiesce, this will be disastrous for electoral outcomes in the short run, and this will directly mean that Republicans will win office, and this will be terrible for black people. Three things in rebuttal. Firstly, what are the consequences of acquiescence? Secondly, the role of race in elections. Thirdly, will the Democrats take the deal? After that, I'll talk about the position that both experienced career politicians and black politicians will be put in as a result of this policy and the stance that the black community taking as proposed by government. Firstly, what are the consequences of acquiescence? Firstly, we're going to say that worse politicians will end up coming in. What do we mean by this? We are not saying that there aren't any qualified black people who are capable of running and being good politicians. Instead, we are saying that to put an arbitrary number of that and to say that it is directly proportional to the number of people in the population is simply untrue. And we say it's similarly untrue that that is true of every other ethnic group, like Irish Americans or Indian Americans. Right? We'd say that simply politics is a unique game where you do require a certain level of experience, right? And to that extent, that is something that is regularly fought about in elections, right? That's why you only run for president, usually when you are really, really old, and as a function of that, the kinds of people that you have running tend to be white because politics used to be an only white man's club. Today, the Black Congressional Caucus has 43 members in Congress and 1 member in the Senate. Say this is incredibly high. It is also true that we have an African American president, and that is something to be immensely proud of, right? We say on their side of the house, these people are shut out and are seen to be like puppets of the establishment, and we think that they lose immense credibility with both all black voters and also all voters in general. We say that that's terrible for the Democratic Party and terrible for black politicians. But also, we say, and this is the reason the Black Caucus has explicitly said they target at 10 to 15%, people who know more about this than they do. Why is that important, right? Because we're going to say that they need the time to kind of build careers and build reputations in order to win elections again and again. The consequence of their policy, if Democrats do acquiesce and black politicians end up getting elected and are ineffective, also note the kinds of politicians that might get fielded as a result of the radical, boycotters selecting candidates might mean that they are unable to work within the Congress and Senate to actually get votes passed, right? That means that they lose elections in the future. So we say that both in the short term and the long term, the Democrats' political interests, also intertwined with African Americans' political interests, lose out significantly. We say that's terrible in terms of tangible harms. Think more voter ID laws, more police shootings without any real consequences, right? We say that's something that Harry introduced, and we say gets significantly worse on their side of the house. We're going to say that also the Democrats will lose if they acquiesce. Why? Can you imagine what Donald Trump will paint them as in the months that this will likely be protracted as? Even if they kind of acquiesce before the next election cycle, there will be months of taunting in which the Democratic Party will look incredibly disorganized and incapable of leadership, right? We're going to say that the closing team needs to come up here and tell us how they are going to win. It is insufficient, given that the Democrats already have the black vote in the status quo, and yet they still don't win every single one of the elections that they compete in. It is insufficient for them to say that solely the black vote will allow them and carry them to victory, right? They also need to win broad support from other ethnic groups who we're going to say are likely going to be turned off by this policy because of the way that the Republicans campaign. You say that's terrible for the Democrats and terrible for African Americans. Secondly, the role of race in elections. Because let's talk about party competition. Because if it was true that the GOP could get African American votes while simultaneously keeping their base, we'd say they get the very expensive data scientists that they employ to find out a way to do that in a combination of policies that allow them to do that. We say it is simply incapable for them to do that. So even if they stage this huge protest, we say it's incredibly unlikely that the GOP becomes more race-friendly to black people. Instead, they're going to clamp down and try and expand the voter turnout in their states, right? And try and get more people to come out in order to win and in order to defeat the Democrats. We say that that's terrible for African Americans and terrible for the Democrats. But we're also going to say that in terms of actual policy, this is worse. Why? Because other politicians will become less likely to work with you, right? This means that all of the policies these guys advocate for and maybe win elections with end up not being enacted, right? They need to show us that these people end up acquiescing, they end up winning elections, and then they end up becoming successful in executing policy. Realize that Congress is gridlocked pretty much all the time, and very few votes, if ever, get passed on most issues, right? With that in mind, we say that it's better to have fewer black people being run and fielded for election under the mentorship and guidance of the Congressional Black Caucus and other experienced politicians, in the sense that they know that they can bring them within spheres of power, within, behind closed doors, and enable them to lobby for votes on important legislation that actually matters for most black people. Closing.
So, at the point where, in the status quo, the Democrats know that they will always continue to win the African-American vote as long as they stay just slightly better than the Republicans, what incentive do they ever have to be more than just marginally better than Republicans for the black community?
A few reasons. First, we'd say that insofar as there are primary elections, there is a multitude, right? Let's assume, in the best case scenario, that there is a very uncompetitive primary. We're going to say that they still need to prove that, like, we just don't think that black people will continue to vote for the Democrats forever, right? Like, if each individual voter decides to hold their local representative accountable, would say that's sufficient. Third, will the Democrats take the deal? They might eventually, but they can't right now. The primaries already happened, and it's too late. Moving on. What are the positions they put incumbents in? Because we're going to say experienced career politicians who are good at their job will poach policy staff who have to pick a winning horse, right? If you are someone who knows how politics works, and you truly believe that the seasoned senator who you support, who is currently being shut out of funding and expertise on your side of the house because the party disbands them in favor of this new candidate, it means you splinter the party, right? This means you get less expertise, and it means the party becomes less strong moving forward. But we also say that makes it worse for them in terms of winning votes and in terms of winning votes within Congress itself. But for black politicians in particular, the 43 congressmen who are currently in the congressional caucus, they have to either choose to decide with their race or side with their party. This is career suicide and immensely risky for them, right? Because either way, they lose. If they side with the African Americans and choose to kind of go on protest and also like disband the Democrats and not vote for everything else, it's incredibly unlikely that any other Democrat will work with them ever again. But also we'd say that if this doesn't work out, they are literally screwed and their representation goes from 43 to 0, right? They need to show us why black congressmen will be able to win as independents if the Democrats don't acquiesce. We win regardless of whether or not the Democrats acquiesce. We beg you to propose. Okay.
Like that, the deputy leader for that speech, begin the debate in the back half of the House, from the member of government. Here.
Before I begin, I'd just like to thank everyone at Tufts University who allowed me to be here today. I'm very grateful. So, that said, I think what is clear from the debate today and from the circumstances that we live in is that radical change is necessary to improve the lot of the black community. Marginal change, waiting, have proven that they cannot work. That is what we're going to offer you on opposing government. So I have a little bit of explicit rebuttal, and then I have one very large point of extension. So explicit rebuttal. First of all, unions refuse to vote for the Democrats all the time when they do things like support free trade, and nobody blames unions. Unions don't get villainized for this. The Democrats don't refuse to ever work with unions in the future because they know that they're part of their coalition. So we think it's absurd when when CG says that this is impossible to ever work with. But aside from this, we hear from opening opposition that black voters threaten to do this all the time, but that these are empty threats. But as we see from unions, one, this is possible, and two, the threat of this can get the Democrats to back down on policy, can get them to refuse to sign certain agreements, so we think that this is efficacious. But on top of that, they say that in the short term, the Republicans will win. But bear in mind, the Republicans already have the House and Senate, and that's not likely to change. So the Republicans already control our government, so the harm seems really marginal here. And on top of that, this is a really good year, because Donald Trump is unelectable. Moderates simply will not turn out to support him. So the harms of doing this in 2016 versus any other year when they have a real candidate like Paul Ryan or when the Democrats have a shot at the Senate is much lower. So we think that this is the perfect opportunity to do something. But on top of that, there is a sense of urgency. Real people are being harmed by policies that exist in the status quo that the Democrats won't do anything to change. We think that you have an obligation as black leaders to do something to help those ordinary people, and that people have a rational self-interest to demand change right now to improve their lives and those of their children. So that said, OO seems to think that the status quo isn't so bad and that black voters need to wait because things are gradually improving. Here's the problem. Black voters have been waiting since Lyndon Johnson was the president, since the Civil Rights Act, and the Democrats have not done everything that they claim to do. It's been an awfully long time since the Civil Rights Act, and the Democrats haven't made another big leap forward since. We think the status quo is unacceptable, and that you need a new change on the same scale as the party realignment in the late 1960s if the black community is ever going to get the respect and equal opportunity that they deserve. If you're ever going to see an end to things like mass incarceration and the war on drugs. But on top of that, we tell you that many times the Democrats don't really even pretend to represent the interests of African Americans. Things like free trade deals, things like harsh on crime Democrats, things like the war on drugs are all obviously against the interests of African Americans, against the interests of working people, and the Democrats do it anyway. Because as I implied in my POI, as long as the Democrats remain one iota better than the Republicans, they know that they can get away with doing anything they want and continue to win the African Americans, and this is a key part of their coalition. So they take African Americans for granted. They don't respect them. They know that they can win those votes anyway. They run white candidates in majority black districts. We think all of this is tremendously problematic and that they have no way to get this to change on their side of the House, and we don't think that the status quo can continue. But the last thing that I'd like to point out here is that party members suggest candidates and leadership. On our side of the House, we can force the Democrats to run more black candidates, get more black candidates into office. One, since people who are in office vote on leadership, you're more likely to have a black Speaker of the House. And two, there's never been a black chairman of the DNC. We think that's atrocious. We think that's much more likely if the black community walks out. We think they're more likely to have pressure on the Democrats to institute African-American leadership. We think it's frankly disgraceful that this has never happened since the party realignment in the 1960s. But on top of that, all those advocacy is basically respectability politics. You need to play ball, you need to do what the Democrats want and still work with you. But this isn't working. It hasn't worked in over 50 years, so we cannot continue the status quo and expect something different to happen. So what is our point of extension? This is a little bit radical. We think that you need a total party system realignment in line with what happened in the 60s, or in line with what happened when the Whigs broke up. But why is this so likely to happen? We see that the last two realignments were both based on the interest of African Americans. We saw that the Whigs collapsed when the Republicans were anti-slavery, and we saw that the parties realigned in the 60s when Democrats tried to court the African American vote. So we think there's absolutely a precedent for this kind of change. So what does this look like? Basically what we're saying is that if they won't seat you at the table, flip the table over, it can't possibly get worse, maybe you'll get a party, who will represent you, we tell you that this is all tremendously great. So in the status quo, the whole apparatus is racist, from the primaries on up. You need to reform everything, because in the status quo, if the committees that select candidates are racist, then they don't pick black candidates, they run white candidates in majority black areas, there's never any change. We can change that by refusing to play ball in this system. So, my first subpoint here is, how can change actually come? The Republicans, after the 2012 election, publicly came out and said that they knew that they needed to court black and Hispanic voters. I'll take you in just a minute. So the Republican establishment knows that they need to attract black and Hispanic voters. And on top of that, their party is just caught on fire and burned to the ground because of Donald Trump. Why can't they build something better from the ashes? If the party of slavery can pass the the Civil Rights Act, why can't the party of George Bush end police brutality? We think this would be a much smaller shift relatively. I'll take over.
Tell us why it's acceptable for African Americans to take on the risk of losing to Republicans for 8 years.
The Republicans already control our government. They have the House and Senate. This is not a big change, and the Democrats aren't in position to win the House and Senate no matter what. That's what actually matters, not the presidency as much. So we think you can take the Democrats and have this control over them without damaging our country more than it already is. But on top of that, I'd like to point out, if the Democrats can lose safe seats, that's tremendously motivating. If areas like Charlotte or inner city Atlanta that have gone Democrat for 40 years are suddenly not going Democrat, gee, maybe they'll listen. If they know they go vote for them, why would they ever listen? The black community has no motivating power on their side of the House. So on our side of the House, we can actually get this motivating power. If you see a temporary third party, maybe that'll hurt the Democrats in the short term. But the Republicans hurt the Whigs in the short term. But what we got in the end was the end of slavery. We think that great things can come from refusal to play ball in a system that is inherently abusive. We think that it's very likely that if black candidates run as a third party or as independents, that you will see a realignment so that one of the parties can grab up these independents, get those seats in Congress. Suddenly there's a huge motivating factor for either party to take advantage of this. We think that this will fundamentally change internal party politics. We think that right now there's no incentive for either party to include black leadership. And on our side of the House, if they want to get those independents, they'll have to offer them something, and many of those bargaining chips will be leadership positions. The status quo is chicken and egg. If there are no black Republicans, or very few black Republicans, then Republicans target their message to whites. We change that if suddenly there's a lot of black votes available. Second point here. What does this actually look like in the or what would this actually look like? So in the status quo, if you're black, you basically have no choice, regardless of your political ideology, about who to vote for, because the Republicans, in many instances, run actively racist candidates. On our side of the House, if you're a black conservative, now you can vote for a small government party and not have that be linked to racism, because a small government party will want to attract your vote because suddenly it's available to them. So we offer much more choice. In the status quo, many African American voters have only an illusion of choice. We offer them real choice on who they want to vote for, regardless of their beliefs or ideology. But on top of that, we tell you that we can end all white campaign committees, end all white leadership, get a black Speaker of the House, things that can never happen on the opposition bench. We can also get things like black candidates in white majority districts. Why is it impossible for the Democrats to do this? Why don't they ever run black candidates in white majority districts? In the status quo, it's because they don't have to. They know we can get away with it. We think we can get this changed by encouraging them to do this because they want to court black voters. So what we offer you on closing government is we change internal party politics to not be racist, and we force a new party system that might serve the interests of the black community. I'm very proud to propose.
Member of
Speaker, we think what's been missing from opening half has been an analysis of how the democratic framework within America actually works. I empathize with being foreign, I don't blame you guys for this. Gee, I'm not sure why this was the case. What are the structural reasons why we think the Democratic Party can't actually deliver on this promise that the African American community demands of them? And therefore, what is the impact on the ability of African American interests to be represented at all within the democratic process, and why is that happening? Secondly, even if you get these candidates, what kinds of candidates are you likely to get when you're trying to increase this number massively in such a short period of time, and why is that problematic? I'm going to very directly respond to the extension after I explain the structural reasons as to why the Democratic Party can't do this. Why do we think that it's impossible within the next couple of months, before the next set of elections, for the Democratic Party to actually do this? First, and more simply, the deadlines to register for the next elections are like in April or May. This means within the next 2 months, they have to set up exploratory committees, set up focus groups, set up general opinion polls, set up donor networks, campaign offices, debates, one-on-one town halls, all of these things that are necessary in order to get the kinds of candidates that you need with a chance of winning. If you know someone who can actually do this in 2 months, put them in touch with me. I really think they should be on the ad score for USUs and Worlds next year. Second, we think that you need candidates who have adequate name recognition and adequate political experience in order to be able to win these things in the first place. The problem is that OG's analysis is true, and that the Democratic Party has systematically not invested in black politicians and leaders. That means these leaders don't exist for you to simply put on the ballot for upcoming elections within the next election or the second one. If that's not true, if OG's analysis isn't true, we think this is likely to happen anyway, in line with the movement towards more and more African American politicians running. What is OG's response to this? OG's response is, but the Democratic Party just doesn't want to invest in African American leaders because they know they have the African American vote anyway. Why is this not true? First, we tell you that there exist massive incentives in terms of increasing the turnout of African American voters every time an African American politician actually stands. So, especially in close districts, Democratic Party candidates have an incentive to ensure that African American candidates actually exist. But secondly, we think it's simply empirically untrue that there hasn't been a massive increase over time in the numbers of African American leaders within the Democratic Party. Eric Holder, Cory Booker, Devil Patrick, Dana Edwards, Loretta Lynch, all of these people have grown through the Democratic Party and directly represent the interests of African American people. Change is real and forthcoming. You make it worse, as I'm going to explain in my second point. No, thank you. What does all of this mean? This means that the Democratic Party either simply cannot agree to your demands, in which case black people will have to decide to boycott the next set of elections, or they will lose. Why is this problematic? When the Democratic Party loses 1/4 of the vote in the presidential elections, that means they definitely lose the presidential election, as O pointed out, but even more perniciously, this is the best chance we have to ensure that we retake a majority in the Senate and the House. There exist down-ballot elections in states across the country where these kinds of things, such as state legislatures, where we think this is incredibly important. The Republicans will win. Now we're going to respond to the extension where they say, what's actually going to happen isn't that the Republicans will win, but there's going to be this mass switching where there's going to be the two parties are going to try, and change the basis that they vote for, which is kind of an alternative take on OG's analysis of now the Republicans will have an incentive to go for the African American vote, and therefore it'll change the kinds of things that happen. No, thank you. Why is this not likely to be the case? First, the Republican Party simply cannot go for the African American vote because it massively alienates the base of every single other person who votes for the Republican Party, the vast majority of whom are working-class white Americans who are incredibly racist. Second, because we don't think that they can convince themselves that African American voters are going to vote for them, because they can't walk back on the statements that they've said where they've dismissed the concerns of African American people, used incredibly offensive language. They can't go back on that. Third, if African Americans represent themselves as a community that are going to boycott the vote when 1/4 of their candidates aren't black, we don't think Republicans are going to believe that this is a political group that they can depend on either, which means they're not likely to go for them. What's more likely to happen is you might have a switch, but the switch that happens is that the Democratic Party now decides we don't need the African American vote. We'll try to go for the working middle class voters who've supported us in the past in the 1960s. This means harking back to the era where the Democratic Party continues to fight for worse criminal justice system reforms and things like that, increasing the racism within the Democratic Party. We don't think that's an outcome that they should be happy about. Opening.
Great.
We explained to you in opening that in the status quo there is no path to change because prioritization of these crises continues to defer that promise of inclusion. Preference the long term because there will never be a joint change until Black Americans get advocates of their own.
That's exactly what I'm going to talk about now. Why the fact that Republicans will win all of these elections that I talked about mean that the ability of Black Americans to be represented within the Democratic Party is fundamentally undermined. And this is also where I respond to CG's analysis of, oh, the Democratic Party is kind of as bad as the Republican Party anyway. What does the Republican Party stand for that will systematically undermine Black representation? First, massive amounts of gerrymandering, which means that the impact of the vote of a Black person is essentially negligent or non-existent within most communities within these states. Second, stalling criminal justice system reform in terms of imposing more and more mandatory minimums, criminalizing things such as crack and soft drugs, which Black people are more likely to be caught holding or using or selling, and therefore put them in prison. There exist 2.2 million Black people in prisons right now. None of these people have the ability to vote. That number will increase massively, therefore systematically undermining the ability of African Americans to actually access democratic process. Third, decrease welfare and education, which means that they don't have the ability to politically mobilize and access these things. Which means even if they get Black candidates running for office, they do not actually have Black people who have the vote to actually vote these people in. Secondly, even if they do get the kinds of candidates they want, what is the nature of these candidates? We think the kinds of candidates that the Democratic Party is going to pick in the process of trying to massively increase the number of Black candidates that it has running within these elections are the kinds of people that they have a problem with. The people like business leaders, for instance, people who subscribe to the respectability politics of what a person who's successful ought to look like, ought to speak like, and is massively out of touch with the actual issues of everyday Black Americans. We think this means that the kinds of people that you get on their side of the house aren't the Black leaders that they actually want, but the kinds of Black leaders which are likely to undermine the cause by saying, oh look, I'm an incredibly successful businessman. I think that if people work hard, they can get to the top. The problem with these things is that these people are not going to get the kinds of changes they want, and it's actually going to make the situation much worse. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for that speech and the debate in the government event. We all welcome the government with here.
Can everyone hear me? Good. I also know that my parents are watching. Hi, Mom. Hi, Mom.
Oh.
So know that I have no sympathy. So, panel, I want to make it very clear on their side of the house what they're advocating, right? They're advocating a continuation of the current system, which is lesser equals. They never deal with this at all. In a world in which you have a two-party system, in which only one party seems to be more close to you and the other is completely crazy, I think that at that point, right, we think fundamentally there's no way to resolve all these tensions. On their side of the house, they tell us why we have these parties, we have these strange Frankensteins, we have all these different views that don't really match, and they're forced to be put together just because there's no third alternative. I think it's a huge problem too. But also, though, as an overview, we realize that party lines change all the time. The Democratic Party has no inherent right to exist. The Democratic Party also has no God-given right to Black votes, right? I think fundamentally on their side of the house, they tell us why we can continue the current iteration of the party system, and why ultimately we can't have party line shifting, given that we're the only two-party system in the world, given that the rest of the world, countries like India, for example, are able to have multi-ethnic parties, large multi-party systems. So with that in mind, though, first we're going to rebuttal and then go into crystallization. So first, the only constructive that Dhruva actually brings us is analysis about the structure. So first of all, I want to tell you that this election is probably the only time you're able to go ahead and change the structure, because this election is losable, right? I'll tell you, first of all, if you want to take the worst case scenario, the Democrats actually lose the presidency to Donald Trump, right? You still have things like filibustering the Senate, they can limit the amount of legislative damages done. I think ultimately, if the American government isn't doing anything anyway, why not do it now? But also though, on the issue of rating, right? So realize, they have to say on their side of the house, people can't act as fast. I made all these jokes about how U.S. news is poorly organized. Personally, I think it was fine. I think ultimately, though, the problem here is this. When people have the motivation to do something, they can work really, really fast. Keep in mind, in the summer of 2012, Latinos went out and said to Barack Obama, you keep deporting our children, you keep deporting refugees, we'll not vote for you. What happened? 2 weeks later, Barack Obama signed an executive action banning deportations, right? And when you give people the motivation to do so, ultimately they will go ahead and do so as well, though. But also, this is stupid logic. Think about this. Democratic presidents weren't able to pass healthcare reform for 90 years. Barack Obama did it in 9 months. When people have the will to do something, and they have the motivation to do something, they do amazing things. And this is ridiculous on their side of the house to say the status quo solves. But ultimately, though, Dhruva lists all these examples too. Like, oh, Black politicians are represented, right? So first, realize many of those positions you listed are appointed positions. This is a huge problem, right? Why isn't there black Speaker of the House? Why isn't there even a black Senate Majority Leader? Right? I think from their side of the House is a huge problem. But ultimately, though, I would tell you that when you look at like the number of positions that were available during that time versus the number of black Democratic Party members, it's minuscule, right? The fact is only able to list 6 or 7 prominent black politicians for the last 20 years is a huge problem on their side of the House. Okay. But also, though, on top of the Republican Party and what's going to happen to it. So we think that social conservatives will probably peel off, and economic moderates as well, too, right? One good thing about Donald Trump is he exposed the hypocrisy in the Republican Party, where you have economic elites versus working class voters. I think ultimately the Republican Party is going to dissolve anyway. The three-party system isn't going to exist for much longer. Why not exploit that at this point, too? On their side of the House, they say, okay, Democrats will go ahead and say we don't need blacks now. So first of all, realize that if you do this, if you go ahead and do this, maybe other groups like Asian and Hispanics will also go ahead and ask for the Democratic Party to advocate for their interests, right? Free trade deals are very good for your Wall Street bankers who are socially moderated, right? And economically moderate, socially liberal. I think ultimately, all these different groups being heard, I think you awaken the consciousness of the other members of the Democratic Party. It's a huge problem for them. Ultimately, we think that the two-party system is done. We're going to go ahead and have new parties form great too. But also, though, we say there are plenty of young people in the status quo right now, right? Who are very disenchanted with politics. I think many of you probably in this room. I think nothing can be done. I think that ultimately people are able to come out and make statements like this and say, we demand radical change, you'll inspire people to go ahead and do things that increase turnout. The last thing they bring us there is about gerrymandering. So realize, people gerrymander because they don't think they can win black votes. At the point at which black votes are now up for play, maybe they'll go ahead and gerrymander back, right? I don't know like what this argument is. Like, understand why people do gerrymandering. You don't do it for fun, you do it for political purposes. Sure, I'll take over there.
Cory Booker sides with his party by running in spite of a boycott he's perceived as betraying his race. If he sides with boycotters, he loses non-black support from a smear campaign.
So I'm glad
Tell us how you don't end the careers of promising black politicians.
So I'm glad you brought this example, right? Fun fact, in New York, black voters, majority, did not vote for Cory Booker when he ran against Sharp James, right? This is a huge problem on their side of the House. You can't just bring out black politicians and say they have to choose between them, given that they're already doing so when they go ahead and pander to business interests and so forth, right? Cory Booker was against things like increasing tax cap on hedge funds, and he had friends in New York who were hedge fund managers, right? This is a huge problem on their side of the House. With that, though, there are questions. One, why now? We say that currently there's too slow change, and their side of the House would just say change is happening anyway, right? If change is too slow, blacks are falling behind, right? When free trade goes ahead, and now low-wage jobs, right, low-skill jobs that are not in Silicon Valley, for example, are being shipped abroad, and ultimately black people are no longer able to earn a basic income, no longer provide for their children. On their side of the House, you fall behind. That is why you have to do it now, though. And so furthermore, again, it's an opportunity here, gone over this extensively, but ultimately on their side of the House, they tell us, one, why anything's going to change, right, if we don't do this, but two, why there will ever be a better time than now, though. Second question, though. So at the worst case, right, we like the third scenario better, but the second scenario is, okay, like the Democratic Party actually acquiesces to this. Why is this better? So first of all, realize that in the status quo, unions already do things like boycott Democratic, or threaten to boycott Democratic elections because of policies like NAFTA. Guess what? Democratic politicians seem to have gone awfully far off from their previous positions supporting things like free trade deals, right? But ultimately, though, Drew gives you a lot of analysis about how internal party politics work right now. If you want to be elected as a Democratic candidate in the United States, you need the support of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee or the DCCC, right? All these leaders, the people who allocate the money, who allocate the volunteers, who allocate the ad time are whites. I'm not saying that's the only reason why they don't pick black candidates. When you go ahead and consider that they consider black voters will vote for them no matter who they put up, ultimately they have a much less incentive to go and do these things. This is a pretty clear problem too. But also, in the Barack Obama example, this is a huge problem, right? Realize that there are silent primaries within parties. People have to win the approval of party elites before they can ever be elected. Harry Reid was caught on tape saying Barack Obama's electable because he doesn't fight back on these kind of narrow lines. Right now, if you are a donor of the Democratic Party, you donate to not the favorite party candidate, it's a huge problem, right? You get pressure from the top. We say when you have a black congressman, you countervail the pressure on the other side too. I also want to talk about how the calculus changes for Democrats, right? Things like welfare reform now, you have to decide, is it worth losing the black vote to go ahead and please certain economic moderates or find the parties involved? Third question then, what happens in a new party system? This is the scenario that we really, really like. So realize right now in the status quo, there are tensions within both parties that don't make sense, right? Why do you have to be economically liberal and economically liberal and social liberal at the same time, right? Why can't you have more things? Why can't you have third parties? You never answer this too. So the parties change all the time as well. Right? Realize at the end of the day, any bold political action has its cost, right? The Civil Rights Act cost Democrats, Dixiecrats for a whole generation. On their side of the House, would say, don't go ahead and do this because you risk losing a huge block of your vote. Barack Obama himself said, the only reason why you get elected is to do hard things. At the point at which they're only concerned about preserving their own seats, no matter what is not happening, right? And on their side of the House, is a huge problem for them. The last thing I want to talk about, though, is ultimately, we think that with a third-party system, you're better able to go ahead and aggregate votes. Black voters can still go ahead and vote in black candidates in cities like Atlanta. For all these reasons, tremendously proud to propose.
The only thing side government succeeds in is making America great again. I think that's terrible. I'm going to explain two possible things that can happen when African Americans threaten this boycott. The first is Democrats don't take the deal. I think this is the likeliest situation just because of pure logistics. It's not an issue of Democratic establishment desire, as OG pointed out, just physically what is possible. The second thing, though, is even if they do take the deal, why is that problematic and why doesn't it achieve the benefits they want? So on the first, why Democrats won't take this deal. So it's not an issue of whether they think it's strategic, but whether it's just physically possible. This is material Druva gives you that they don't respond to, and that differentiates us from OO. Now, what are the logistical concerns of starting a campaign? You need to introduce the candidate. You need to find a campaign staff. You need to set up ground offices. You need to have town hall meetings. It is just impossible to do that and have a candidate presentable by 2016. That's incredibly important because the additional material Druva introduces in his speech that they don't respond to is why is 2016 so important? Because it's the chance for Democrats to regain control of every branch of federal government and also get down ballot wins. Why is this true? First, the presidency, Trump's behind, but he's only behind Clinton about 5% in the polls, and Cruz, who's also somewhat a realistic candidate for the Republican nomination, is only behind 1%. If Democrats lose 20% of the population because black people don't vote, and the main deciding factor is white people who generally vote more Republican, they lose the presidency. On the Senate, we just get a lie from the MG where it says the Senate's not up for election. Democrats need to win 4 seats if they win the presidency to regain the Senate. That means Russ Feingold in Wisconsin, he's probably not going to win it if he can't get blacks in Milwaukee. Tammy Duckworth in Illinois is probably not going to win the Democrat seat if she cannot win black votes in Chicago. In Philadelphia, if you can't turn out black votes for Pennsylvania, you don't win that. And in Ohio, you don't win if you can't get Cincinnati. That's problematic because now you lose the chance to actually regain the Senate. Finally, in the House, we tell you that because the Republican nominee is so unpopular, i.e. Trump, many people think it is possible to either win because of ticket splitting is very uncommon, or the fact you come very close. But what happens on their side of the House when Democrats lose all these races? In this response, the only response we get that, it'll only be a little damage because you constrain the harm. You get the unholy trifecta of President Trump, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and Speaker Paul Ryan. I think that is the worst implication because what it means is there are no longer veto players in the system to stop Republicans from doing terrible things. Things like going to war in Iraq, or things like the Bush tax cuts that happened the last time Republicans owned every single branch of government. Why is this incredibly problematic? Because it does talk about the long term they want to engage. That they envision a future where when Democrats take this deal, black people go out and vote. But that doesn't happen if they're all disenfranchised by increasing voter ID laws and increasing gerrymandering. Additionally, what Druva tells you and what they don't respond to is that Democrats also have to change their behavior because they do want to have a chance of winning the election. But what they do is now they have to become competitive for the white vote. They do that by being racist, similar to how Bill Clinton did in the 1990s. So what that means is right now, policies like mass incarceration reform are bipartisan issues. On their side of the House, racism is the bipartisan issue because you're competing over the white working class, which means the system becomes fundamentally skewed against them. Refutation of their idea that there's party realignment. So one, this is a response Druva gives that they don't answer, which is that it's impossible because you have to talk about what the base and coalition would look like. We tell you the Republican base of white people in the South who are racist, socially conservative is an incompatible base with African Americans. That's why Republicans can never try to get to them. But the second thing is history says that when one party is in disarray and the other party isn't, that party will do well. Last time this happened, 1964, LBJ wins the election, passes the Civil Rights Act, because the Republicans were a mess under Goldwater. What we get basically from the government whip is this idea that, Republicans have shot themselves in the foot, so Democrats should too, because then it'll be roughly equal. No, we say take advantage and get massive political change on our side of the House because we are able to push that through. That's incredibly important. Finally, what we get from OG about long-term change. Firstly, what long-term change are we getting? I think the Affordable Care Act provided health care to millions and millions of black people around the country. That is change you cannot just ignore from your privilege. The second thing is we tell you that there are candidates in our appointments, that Obama's court appointments have been nearly 30% black, which means they have a lot of influence in the legal system. These changes also escalate off each other because people who are in the cabinet can now run for office and endorse other prominent black politicians, which means I think we're moving forward. The reason why I think this is different from history past is demographic change. pages, that for once, white majority is in threat as the amount of Latinos and black people increase in society and the presence of white people goes down, which means there is a chance for a more racially equal society. We say they send them back. Opening.
Right. Rates of imprisonment, rates of brutality have remained basically the same.
We see that if there is change, that change is too slow. So we don't care if we lose this election, but we've explained to you why long-term change is likely to happen when the Republican base is shrinking, when Democrats do change, and that forces that sort of political realignment in America.
You can't get long-term change if later when you rely on black people to vote, they're all disenfranchised because of all the Republican policies that get passed on your side of the House.
Yeah.
Second issue in this debate, what happens when Democrats do take the deal? This is material Druva gives you that goes cold conceded. He tells you that the types of people likely to be politicians are necessarily privileged because you need access to resources and startup capital for a campaign. That's things like lawyers, businessmen, generally wealthy people. But those aren't the oppressed black people that they're talking about, people who suffer from the school to prison pipeline, people who suffer from poverty, people who suffer from employment discrimination, which means there's not necessarily the empathetic lived experiences connection that up and down the bench they talk about. And I think the empirical case of this is that if their logic were true, that black politicians will always look out for black people in society, then Obama would have been much more aggressive in executive orders for helping black people, and we didn't see that was the case. In fact, we saw the opposite, because he always wanted to distance himself from the black community, so he didn't seem too radical. Perfect example, they say free trade is something that hurts black people. The biggest proponent in the Democratic Party for free trade was Barack Obama. They don't necessarily get that change. What they do get, though, is the harm. You get the narrative that, oh, because one black person was successfully elected as an elected official, that means racism doesn't exist. You get people saying things like, oh, because we have a black president, racism doesn't exist. Because what you only do is get change at the top, not at the ground level where the actual oppression is happening, because you discourage the political will that's currently existing in the status quo to get policies that decrease structural violence, that do things like bipartisan criminal justice reform, that do things like provide health care. We tell you, you should not shoot yourself in the foot just in pursuit of a higher goal, and if you are, at least do it in a better way than what they propose. Incredibly proud to oppose.